Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session on the state of voting rights today. My name is Rachel Campbell, and I'm the Interagency Committee Facilitator for the Alumni Association. I graduated from Louisiana State University in 2019, where I served as a Vote Everywhere Ambassador for 2 years, the Vice President of Go Vote LSU for 2 years, and as LSU Student Body Vice President. As a Vote Everywhere Ambassador, I worked to secure funding for Turbo Vote LSU, institutionalized voter registration, registered over 3,000 students, faculty, and staff to vote, and helped to adjust polling precinct lines to make on-campus voting easier for students. And I'm currently a rising 2L at Tulane Law. Here with us today is Marc Elias. He is a nationally recognized authority and expert in voting rights, redistricting, and campaign finance. He is the chair of Perkin Coy's political law group and the founder of Democracy Docket, which is the leading platform for progressive advocacy and information about voting rights, elections, redistricting, and democracy. As a litigator, Marc has handled hundreds of cases involving politics, voting rights, and redistricting, and he has successfully argued and won 4 cases in the US Supreme Court, as well as dozens of cases in state Supreme Courts and the US Courts of Appeal. Marc launched Democracy Docket in March 2020 when it became clear that voting rights were going to be central in the November election and in the future of democracy. As we approach a once-in-a-decade redistricting process, Marc is already fighting partisan gerrymandering and is continuing to defend voting rights from suppressive laws and practices. Marc is alumnus of Hamilton College and Duke Law School and is a proud owner of a Portuguese water dog named Bode. So Marc, I feel the state of voting rights today is probably best contextualized by the Supreme Court's ruling in Shelby County v. Holder. Could you explain to our audience what the court held and how that holding affected the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me, Rachel, and I'm thrilled to be here. So to understand what the court did in Shelby County, you have to go back a little bit and realize that when the Voting Rights Act was passed, it had a variety of provisions, some of which applied nationwide, some of which, though, one key one that applied to states with histories of discrimination based on race. And that's sometimes referred to as Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And what Section 5 said was that if you are a jurisdiction that has a history of racial discrimination in voting, then before you can make changes to your voting laws or rules or policies, they have to get reviewed by the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., or by a federal district court in Washington, D.C., and pre-cleared is the term that is used. So that there is a check before laws go into effect that might negatively impact minority voting rights. They have to be reviewed, and if they're going to negatively impact voting rights of minority voters, then they can be blocked. There's an opportunity for the state or the county to go to court and challenge that. But it played a vital role as preventing laws from going on the books that were going to negatively impact voting rights. What the Supreme Court did in Shelby County was said that the coverage formula, the way by which those states and localities were chosen, was outdated, and therefore they struck that down. The efforts to restore the Voting Rights Act through the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act through the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would restore it by refashioning the coverage formula to be up to date with 2021 data.
How are we seeing the effects of that ruling play out today in the state legislatures?
So we're seeing it in very dramatic ways. I mean, the fact is that many of the laws we've seen pass simply could not have passed if Shelby County had not happened. I mean, the Georgia law would never have been pre-cleared. The Florida law, not all of Florida is covered, but there are a couple of counties, and that would affect statewide legislation. It wouldn't have been pre-cleared. The Arizona laws would have been subject to pre-clearance, and of course, Texas would be subject to pre-clearance. So not every state or was covered. So the laws, for example, in Iowa probably still would have taken effect, but it would have done a tremendous amount of good in states that were covered under the coverage formula.
Could you tell us about how you're challenging these laws in the courts?
Sure. So, look, what we're seeing is an avalanche of voter suppression laws in state after state after state. We have filed lawsuits against 6 states so far since January. The first was Iowa. Iowa was the first state to pass a massive rewrite of their voting laws, mostly their vote by mail, but other laws. That bill was signed, and we challenged it on behalf of LULAC of Iowa. That was followed by, as everyone knows, Georgia. We've sued Georgia. That was followed by Florida. We've sued Florida, Montana. We've sued Montana. Kansas passed a bad law. It was vetoed by the governor, and then the Republican legislature overrode the veto. We're challenging that law. And Arkansas. Arkansas passed a voter suppression law. And I wish I could say that was the end, but that's kind of the beginning. And in each of these cases, we're making arguments either that they are affecting all voters in a negative way without a good reason by the state to do so. They're impinging the right to vote. Or in some states as well, they're also impacting either minority voters or young voters, and therefore violating the Voting Rights Act, the 15th Amendment, or in the case of young voters, the 26th Amendment.
You've touched on this already, but if passed, how would the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act impact this current landscape of voting rights?
Well, so it's a really important question, because one of the reasons why the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is essential but not alone enough is that the whole structure of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is looking forward, right? It is saying, is a voting law change retrogressing? Is it making voting harder than the baseline was? Well, the problem is Georgia, Florida, Texas not yet, but Florida, Kansas, Arkansas, Iowa, they've already changed their laws. So, the Georgia law, for example, if you now passed an anti-retrogression ban, the baseline would be the law as it exists now. So that's the reason why the For the People Act is also a vitally important piece. But the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would be essential because it would prevent, moving forward, states from being able to pass these laws first and thus us having to sue over them afterwards. The Section 5 prevented the laws from taking effect in the first instance.
So you mentioned the For the People Act. So if this act was passed, could you explain what impact it would have on the state of voting rights?
Yeah, so the For the People Act is a very important bill. It has several component pieces of it. Some of them deal with campaign finance. Some of them deal with governmental ethics. A key provision or set of provisions deals with redistricting, preventing partisan redistricting, which is very, very important. And then what I think of as the core of the bill is the voting sections, the portions that deal with ensuring that there are adequate opportunities to vote. So the way to think about the For the People Act is it sets a baseline. It sets a floor. It says basically every state has to provide at least this much opportunity to vote in person, early, by mail. It has to provide this basic framework as a minimum. States are free to provide more than that, right? Many, many states do provide more voting opportunities than would be provided for in the For the People Act, but states couldn't provide less. So that's why it works in tandem with the John Lewis bill, because one of them sets a minimum floor and the other basically prevents voting rights from being eroded.
So you mentioned the gerrymandering provisions. Could you give our attendees some context about how gerrymandering is weaponized to suppress voters, especially those in marginalized communities?
Yeah, so look, gerrymandering is just a form of voter suppression. I mean, if you think about it, you can suppress the vote by either preventing people from being able to vote, not counting their vote if they did vote, or by simply drawing the district such that their vote really won't make a difference because the politicians have chosen the voters, not the other way around. So, so what partisan gerrymandering allows is for partisan actors to divvy up voters in ways that are beneficial to the politicians who are drawing the maps, but not necessarily beneficial for the communities that are at stake. So they are oftentimes carving up voters and destroying what we refer to as communities of interest. They are sometimes affecting the ease with which you can travel within a district. We've all seen the stories of college campuses being split, where they put one part of the campus in one district and another part in another. And so it's a really pernicious thing that that unfortunately the Supreme Court also in another case recently allowed. And we've seen some states under their state constitutions ban partisan gerrymandering, but it's really important that Congress do this at a federal level, because those rules ought to apply everywhere.
Also, parts of the act address the campaign finance issues that were raised by the Citizens United case, now decided over a decade ago. Could you provide background on that decision and also explain how it affected campaign finance regulations?
Yeah, so this is something that for those of you who are in law school, thinking about going to law school, or have gone to law school, should always keep in mind, which is that the effect of court decisions are not just on the litigants in that case. In fact, they're not always even just on similarly situated people in those cases. They can have profound effects on the way in which our society operates and the way in which the culture of our society operates. So Citizens United is a great example of that. Citizens United on its face said that corporations can make unlimited independent expenditures. Okay? The US Supreme Court had said in the 1970s that individuals could make unlimited independent expenditures. That is, they could spend an unlimited amount of their own money running television ads, telling people who to vote for and vote against. And in its limited form, you could, conservatives would say, all that it says is that corporations can do the same thing. What in fact it did was operate as a signaling device that the Supreme Court was going to let big money into politics in every way possible. And in fact, that's been the result. So we've seen a vast increase in the amount of individual spending on independent expenditures that really wasn't going on before Citizens United. We've obviously seen corporations, nonprofit corporations, and others get involved, but it has really transformed our political campaign finance system, in that what we refer sometimes as outside groups, right? Super PACs or 501c organizations that are running independent expenditures. These groups are oftentimes spending as much money on an individual election as the candidates themselves. So it's really not even fair to think of them as somehow outside of the process. They are, in many places, they are dominating the process, or at least they're playing a really large role. And it has led to a number of distortions in the political electoral system that were probably foreseeable, but I think it's fair to say the Supreme Court didn't focus on.
Also, I was wondering if you could share some insight about corporate America's role. They seemingly play antithetical roles as both donors to state legislators who support voter suppression, but somewhat more recently, they've collected, capital coalitions, including major executives, to run against voter suppression legislation, at least the ones that have come out more recently.
Yeah, so look, I'm not the person to ask if you want a warm and fuzzy statement about how much corporate America is doing. I wrote an op-ed recently on Democracy Docket saying that big business offered democracy its thoughts and prayers. I mean, it's great that they all issued a bunch of PR statements saying how they stand with democracy and they oppose voter suppression. That's great. A number of companies came out against the Georgia bill after the Georgia bill passed. But where were they before the Arkansas bill passed? Where were they before the Kansas bill passed, before the Florida bill passed, and before the Texas bill that is coming up passes? So corporate America liked the idea of issuing nice statements about this, but where's the action? Where are they? I ask this regularly on Twitter, like, can someone point me to the place where a major corporation is employing the same firepower to defeat anti-voting legislation as they do to defeat Clean Water, Clean Air Act laws, or to prevent business taxes from being raised? I mean, one of the things that always drives me crazy is corporate executives will sometimes ask me, well, what can we do? what possibly can we do? And I'm thinking like, wait a second, you guys solve problems all day long. Like, when it comes to the business tax being increased, you're not like, woe is us, what can we do? Right? You mobilize, you spend money, you spend resources, you build coalitions. When it comes to wanting a more business-friendly climate in a state, you build coalitions, you contact legislatures, you amass your resources around it. And I frankly, for my part, am disappointed that we're not seeing more of big business doing that. There are some instances, Patagonia has been a phenomenal leader on this, but it's not. But by and large, most of corporate America has issued nice statements, but not done a lot.
So generally, campaign finance, gerrymandering, all these other efforts to restrict voting rights, it affects all of us. But in your opinion, what are the most significant obstacles that college-age voters face today related to access to the ballot?
Yeah, so this has been a passion of mine for years, actually going back to my time in college. I went to a small liberal arts college in upstate New York. And it was the kind of place where the student population, even though quite small, could make a difference in close local elections, and even at that point, the congressional elections, still actually a very competitive congressional district. And I noticed that at that time, and this was a long time ago, there was an antipathy from local election officials in letting college students participate in the elections. That was in New York. And what we have seen is that antagonism against participation by college students where they go to school remains today. We have seen it in states like Florida, where we sued them successfully because Florida had a provision that allowed early voting sites to be located in any public building in the state except on a college or university campus. We've seen it in New Hampshire, where the state of New Hampshire's Republican legislature continues to has targeted several bills targeted at college students. We are seeing it in a bill that actually just was signed by the governor of Texas that deals with how you establish residency for purposes of voting in Texas, which, by the way, seems to be aimed at both disenfranchising college students who are in Texas and college students who leave Texas who might want to still vote in Texas. Discrimination against college voting remains one of the most acceptable forms of overt unconstitutional behavior on the part of legislatures. And it's a problem. But let me give you one other problem. And this is where I've been tough on colleges. Colleges also know how to solve problems. When colleges and universities want to use their muscle to advocate on behalf of themselves and their students, they are able to do so. And so it's important that colleges and universities make a point of telling their local communities, the communities that want their jobs, want the money, want the cultural affairs, that a precondition for those things is allowing their student body to fully participate in democracy. If a town or a city or a state does not want a college student to participate in their democracy, then the college ought to define that relationship on those terms. And they too, very oftentimes, have loud lobbying voices and the ability to mobilize significant resources. So I think there's a lot more colleges can do on this front. I also think every college needs to treat ensuring student voting with the same urgency that I saw. I have two college-age kids. When my son just graduated, and I saw their university mobilize around COVID. I'd love to see college and universities mobilize around student voting, where they are acting as a facilitator of student voting. They're not just playing a passive role, but they're actually helping make sure their students vote, whether they vote at their university or college address, or whether they vote back where they came from.
So when our institutions fail us, what are ways that students can fight against new and existing restrictions, to their and others' right to vote?
Yeah, so first of all, like I said, it's unlikely, I won't say never, but it is unlikely that most people are going to turn up a existing, clearly unconstitutional voting provision, except when it comes to young voters. Because there are all over the place, college students are subjected to discriminatory voting behaviors that are unacceptable. So One is to obviously bring it to the attention of the college and university and hope that they become an advocate for it, which is what I tell college and university presidents they need to do. The other is to bring litigation. You know, we've brought litigation on behalf of college students. I'm always looking to bring litigation to vindicate college student and other young voters' rights to vote, because I do think it's so important. And we have a problem in this country where we have a differential rate of voting, voting and vote counting, by the way. I'll tell you a really quick statistic. In Florida in 2018, if you were 18 to 21 and you voted by mail in Florida, you had a 5.4% chance of rejection with your mail-in ballot. If you were over 65, you know what that was? 0.6. It was 1 out of every 20 young voters and 1 out of 200 older voters. And so even the way in which the ballots are being processed and counted was discriminatory. So if you're a college student, you feel like that's happening to you, that either your ballot, you're not being given an opportunity to vote, or there's barriers being put in place of you in your place, or that your votes aren't being counted. You know, talk to college and university and consider litigation.
One final question for you, Mark. What advice would you give to students who are interested in becoming a voting rights or election law attorney?
So look, I wish that there was not as big a need for voting rights lawyers as there is. You know, the field of election law generally has been growing because campaigns have been growing, and the people involved in more and more people have been involved in politics. The amount of money being raised bigger, the stakes are bigger. There are more complicated legal issues involved. You know, I always tell people when I represented John Kerry's campaign in 2004, if you wanted to make a John Kerry for President t-shirt, you were free to have at it. By the time we got to 2008, my firm represented the Obama campaign, and you know there was a trademark on the logo, and it was a whole. And you know now the sale of merchandise is in and of itself a legal area for campaigns. On the voting rights front, like I said, it's growing mostly due to voter suppression. And if it's something that you're interested in, go to law school. And you know now there are opportunities to take classes in election law that cover things like campaign finance and in voting rights, and take those classes because there's a lot of need out there.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. And also thank you to our audience for joining us for Rise Up Weekend.